Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew McQuilla, and I am back again with Professor Larry Catá to discuss his book, Hong Kong, Between One Country and Two Systems. Today, we will be discussing Chapter 21, Stalemate, The Storm Continues Unabated. This is written on Monday, December 30th, 2019. How are you doing, Professor Backer?
I am doing just fine and really excited to be back and chatting a little more about the book.
Yeah, we did take a little bit of a hiatus, but now that we're back in it, we're now in the chapters, the 20s, and we come to the close of the year in 2019. So tell us a little bit about what was going on at this time during this stalemate.
Yeah, it was very interesting. As you recall, when we started, it was literally every day, June, July, August, and September, where things were just happening. And one can begin to see that as the protests begin at the beginning of June, there's a lot of activity, and it made sense. The central authorities had to quickly develop their own position and then figure out how they could, at very little or at a minimum risk to their international position and their other strategic aims, go ahead and implement it. The local authorities had to figure out how to deal with this. And that really huge fractious group of protesters who come from a variety of different perspectives and have a variety of different goals had to begin to coalesce around some core ideas of ultimately becomes the 5 demands. And the international community has to get their own act together, where their views were not necessarily initially aligned, and where you had to deal with how you can merge this is a really tough thing for the international community, to merge the trajectories of internationalism against the increasingly strong embrace of some notion of national sovereignty, right? How do you recognize that Hong Kong is China at the same time, and therefore subject to Chinese authority, at the same time providing a space for the authority of international law to guide, constrain, or otherwise manage the way in which the Chinese central authorities undertake their sovereign prerogatives within Hong Kong. So all of this is going on, and there's a lot of work. And so we had lots and lots of discussions about all this stuff. And then things start to begin to develop a pattern. That's what you begin to see. No one's really moving. And by December, what becomes clear, and so we slow down. Things don't change as much as we begin putting I'm using an old term, we put everything on shuffle mode, right? And so we hear the same things over and over in random patterns. And indeed, that's what winds up happening. You have this pattern. And so by December, we are seeing less interesting new interventions, but a lot of new things all wrapping around what are becoming increasingly well-defined both positions and patterns of behavior. And so that's what happens by the end of the year. At this point, you're taking stock, and yet at the same time, you're beginning to see the possibilities of what looks like what may be emerging as a permanent state within Hong Kong.
So you talk about what begins to emerge as a permanent state, and so we move into this discussion of Lee. And why did you transition into discussing this?
On the Lao Tse. Yeah,
Yes.
this is very interesting. So 2 things are going on in my mind at this point. This is the end of the year, and this is a chapter in which I'm taking stock. Things seem to be moving in a particular direction, and so what I wanted to do was use Lao Tse's notions of Li, or virtue. It's not quite virtue, but that'll get us to where we need to go, to kind of discuss both my sense that we might well be seeing the emergence of a new, very turbulent normal within Hong Kong. This is ratcheting up, putting on steroids, the sort of dynamic interaction between all of the Hong Kong forces that had already been emerging for the last 10 or 15 years, but now in your face on all sides. but now stable. I mean, this between June and December is a relatively long time. And you begin to see repetitious patterns of actions, counteractions from all sides. So and so you've got like five people. You've got the international people, you've got the central authorities, you've got the local authorities, you've got the protest communities. All right, so at least 4 or 5 groups, all of them now engaging. These are all of and they began to look like Lao Tse's notions of the superior man, right? The superior individual, superior virtue, inferior virtue, superior kindness, superior justice, and then ultimately the man of superior lead, because each of the actors now begin to take on what appears to be some of the characteristics of superior virtue, the nature of the virtuousness, its consciousness, the notion of inferior virtue, the notion of what a superior, the actions or inactions, the ulterior motives of superior virtue, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I did. Of course, you'll have to read the book to see how it all interacts. But all of this in the context of what begins to look like a fairly stable period of turbulence, in part, right? And that's the ulterior motive, that the turbulence itself becomes the virtuous position. And yet within that, every one of the actors in the group, to the horror, of course, of the central authorities, but everyone else is profiting from this. There's an ulterior motive and some value for this. The local authorities can talk about chaos and use this to more closely align themselves to the central authorities. The dynamic position allows greater interaction between the protest communities and the international communities. The international community can begin looking at this, not just in the context of developing these notions that we talked about earlier about fractured or shared sovereignty, that is the difference between territorial sovereignty and operational sovereignty, the role of international law in that context, the nature of autonomy and self-determination within systems rather than as a means of breaking away from a system. All of this stuff is now showing up here. And indeed, it looked like if there was going to be any movement by the end of December, it looked like the momentum was really on the side of the protester constellation groups, the pro-democracy portion of which appeared to have, in the context of the November elections, appeared to have a momentum toward gaining the hearts and minds of a good chunk of the Hong Kong population, again, to the horror of the central authorities who are now much more deeply and publicly committed to the normalization of Marxist-Leninist sensibilities within the autonomous region, certainly to the horror of the local officials who see that they are less effective than their propagandists would make them out to be, and to some extent leaving the international community in a somewhat flummoxed state. The international community plays a very odd role here, very good at bleeding out theory from time to time, but really relatively ineffective, I guess, except on the sidelines and probably in the closed rooms, to which I certainly have no access. At the same time, it becomes so obvious by now that the international community is itself fractured along lines of self-interest. The Americans, of course, having much bigger fish to fry, game to catch, I forget what the expression is, with the Chinese, right? This is just a small part of ordering a hugely complicated revolutionary transformation in the relations between the Americans and the Chinese. The international communities in Geneva and New York have their own problems. They are navigating between very touchy sensibilities. You don't want to go too far down the sovereignty is all international route, because then Europe becomes 1,000 autonomous regions, and all kinds of other places blow up. At the same time, you don't want to cabin international law as nothing more than just words on a sheet of paper that can only be given life by states phlegmatically or not. And so that what that does is create that space, or look like that space, where the central authorities still believe it's too risky to do more than to continue to re-emphasize their positions, right up through Xi Jinping's speech, which we talked about, I think, last time or the time before. The international community is doing the same. And within that, the local people have a significant dynamic kind of space where it looks like the local authorities are going to have to make a space, a dynamic space, right? Because these things are going to be shifting all over the place, for people who don't share their views. And all of this suggests the ulterior motives, the different nature of the virtues, allows this virtue notions that are looking like they're becoming the norm now in Hong Kong. And of course, all of this, from our perspective now, is extraordinarily ironic, because we are looking at something that is appearing to go this way, and this tiny little virus that by the end of December is already just working its way everywhere, is about to make its appearance. And once it does, all this stuff gets swept away.
And you know that I like to look at things in sort of a hindsight looking glass sometimes when we get to the end of these discussions, discussing the chapters. And so you sit here and you call it stalemate, you call the chapter stalemate, and you come to this fairly interesting moment where there's still 11 more chapters following. And so when there's 11 more chapters following, you know, this is not going to end in a stalemate. And you talk about the little teeny virus coming in. To me, this is parallel to two football teams being ramped up for the biggest game of the season. And last year, and probably the most unpredictable year in football history, you have two teams ramping up for a big game, and then one has a COVID outbreak on the team, and they have to forfeit the game pretty much. And that is the way that sometimes I see these next 11 chapters going. But it's really interesting to see at this moment in time, it was not so and is not so. And so
That's right. But we didn't know. I mean, but
yeah,
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But we didn't know. So the virus could have hit both teams, or the virus could have hit in ways that a team could have excised a couple of people and still played, right? Depending on where or how this thing occurs. All kinds of things are still possible, but it didn't happen that way, right? And in our case, right, the virus could have destroyed the viability of the local authorities as easily as it could have been used for what it was. It could have crippled, right, the Chinese central authorities. It could have crippled the international community. It could have manifested itself in a bunch of different ways, and it didn't. And that's what makes this interesting. All of a sudden you throw, like you say, you throw this thing, divine intervention, the irony of the unpredictable, whatever you want to call it, the natural things, serendipity, and things that look like they are heading in a particular direction. And in this case, something that would have been new and actually quite interesting, kind of unstable stability, right, within Hong Kong. And we don't know how long the central authorities would have tolerated it, but they might have been prepared to tolerate it for a while. But we'll never know, of course. And instead, that doesn't happen. Although at the end of December, and that was the thing, and it's important to, I think, and for me, in writing the book, it was important, it's the capturing of that moment that's important, because in hindsight, all of this gets leveled out and washed away. And so it loses its importance and its sense, because what you're doing is you're focusing on the end. But what is it? It's, in this case, really, it's the journey that's the destination, and that journey produces consequences that will be felt. This crystallizing moment with the elections at the end of November, the movements at the beginning of December, are not going to be lost. They're now going to be added in some ways that we still don't know quite yet. They're going to be added to the stew pot that is going to be Hong Kong moving forward. But for this moment, it really did look like, wow, this is unbelievable. What started out in June as very specific protests have now effectively transformed perhaps the way that governance, that the forms of governance will be accepted in ways that one would have thought impossible, right? Because certainly the central and local authorities are looking for stability and prosperity. The business community is worried about their own position, the international community, the protesters, blah, blah, blah. And yet business is still going on, and yet things still get done, and everything gets normalized in a particular way. Humanity has a way of being able to routinize, in a sense, and to take into account, or the economists would say, to price and therefore find the most efficient means of dealing with whatever it is that's thrown at you. And if this is going to be the quote unquote new normal, at some point you may hate it, but you're going to shrug your shoulders and you say, I got to live, I got to eat, right? I got to do this or that. And then you figure a way to do it until the moment comes when you don't have to do it anymore. Right? And then I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, what were you saying?
I said, and so this is one of those moments. And so here you've got a group of people of superior and inferior virtue, of superior kindness and of superior justice, all of whom are moving around with ulterior motives. And then the question is, of course, the last of Lao Tse's notions, the looking or pointing to the time when the man of superior virtue acts and finding no response will roll up his sleeves to force it onto others. That's where we're going, except we didn't know where that was going to take us at this time, but that's where we're going. And so this is like this nice, here's the vision of where we think we're going. Welcome to COVID land, starting in January, and then everything is different.
Well, I feel like this was a fairly justified place to end the year and provide us for not a clean slate, but a more balanced slate for what was going to occur following. And so unless you have anything else to add to this chapter, I think we can just about wrap it up.
No, just buy the book.
All right, everyone, you heard it from the author himself. Go out and buy the book, and we look forward to doing the final couple of chapters over the next couple of weeks. And you have a good day.
All right, thank you. You too.
You're welcome.